I think something really significant is happening in the city of Seattle that could have an impact on the rest of the state and also maybe other areas of the country where you have very progressive policies that are hurting businesses, that are hurting housing providers and landlords, and making the state and our communities worse off for everyone. So we saw this coming. I mean, this is not a surprise. I'm going to take you in detail to start the show. We'll probably spend a half hour on this, so just a heads up, but it's that important. There was a story in April out of the Seattle Times that brought up an issue that at the time we covered it, we knew was happening behind the scenes and we knew was going to become a problem. So this is an April 2024 headline from the Seattle Times. Unpaid rent in low-income housing skyrocketed. Evictions may be next. And it talked about this issue of even in very low income housing units, you know, the state and city talk about that an awful lot, the need for these, people weren't paying rent. And of course, what did the Seattle Times article chalk it up to? The increase in unpaid rents can be traced to the pandemic, which was a hurricane of economic disruptions, especially at the lowest rungs of the ladder. And when we talked about that Seattle Times article back on April 22nd of 2024, I went back, I watched our coverage of it. We called BS on that then, that this was not a pandemic issue. They blame everything on the pandemic. What is the issue? You know what the issue is. Nicole knows what the issue is. I know what the issue is. The issue is overregulation. The issue are these regulatory burdens that are being placed on landlords big and small, that are being placed on low-income housing providers and, you know, market value housing providers. You know, did things get weird and maybe worse during the pandemic? Sure, but a lot of this can be traced back to roughly 2018, when all of these anti-landlord policies started to be pushed through in the city of Seattle. And remember, this is a Seattle-based story we're going to talk about today, but its tentacles have already reached Olympia. They tried last year, this past legislative session, to push through rent control. They didn't succeed, but they'll probably succeed in the coming year, depending on the results of the November election. So this stuff matters to every single person watching. If you're watching in a blue state, I mean, California, Oregon, and other blue states following suit to these insane policies. So that happened. And this real burden on low-income housing providers, which the state says they need, which the cities say we need more tax money, we need more housing units, we need more affordable housing units, yet they crush them with regulation so that they have people who are living there who they can't evict and who aren't paying rent. And then they're already low-income housing buildings. And so they're not making money hand over fist. Their margins are this big. And so then what happens? Well, then they're going to have to close. They're going to have to default. And then all those units go away. So there has been a lawsuit that was just filed by GRE Downtowner. They run a low-income housing building on 4th Avenue in Seattle called the Addison. And this is, as a constitutionalist, this is fascinating to me. But essentially, they are suing the city of Seattle, arguing that the city of Seattle has essentially committed a regulatory taking. That their building and their profits and everything have suffered immensely at the hands of the regulation of the city of Seattle, so much so that it amounts to a regulatory taking of private property. This one paragraph in this lawsuit sums it up perfectly. It says, the city's ordinances have destroyed the value of the Addison as a sustainable low-income housing development. This impact is especially troubling given that the LIHTC program, which is what allows them to kind of get some federal funds to provide these, is the federal government's primary policy tool for encouraging the development and rehabilitation of affordable rental housing. The city's flawed ordinances have functionally commandeered the properties of private housing providers and placed massive costs on them. The ordinances have made it impossible to own and operate low-income housing safely and efficiently in Seattle, trapping GRE Downtowner and other housing providers in a situation where it must subsidize the cost of housing recidivist criminals to the tune of millions of dollars per year and roughly $5.8 million through 2023 and more for 2024. So you have, via your regulations, put us in an impossible situation. We're not making any money. We're not even breaking even. We're way, way, way in the red, as they provide proof for, which we'll go through painstakingly in the 20 minutes to come. And so as a result, it is akin to the government taking our property for its own purposes. which the government is not supposed to be able to do. So as I said, in this lawsuit, they provide in such, exquisite detail how the various housing policies passed by the city of Seattle, literally a timeline, have ruined their business model, their ability to collect rent, their ability to turn even a modest profit to go toward operating costs and pay their lenders. So I want to go through all this with you because to me, it's undeniable. To me, this is absolutely a justified lawsuit, but should be a very easy lawsuit for them to win. And if they can do that, can have resounding positive impacts on what we're seeing in Seattle and elsewhere. So first, they have this graph that I think is really illustrative. If you're watching the show rather than listening to it today, this might be a little more illustrative for you, but I'll describe it the best I can. It talks about the legislative financial impact. There's a few lines they have on the graph. So they've got their occupancy rates, their expenses, which are illustrated by a dashed red line, and then they've got their profit and losses. And along the way, as time progresses, they have plotted on this graph all the different anti-landlord, anti-housing provider policies that have made their lives a living hell throughout the years. And so you see that in 2016, 2017, 2018, they were doing okay. Their occupancy rates were good. They were turning a modest profit. Remember, this is low-income housing units, so they're not making money hand over fist. But then 2018 into 2020 and on, you start to see that drop off. Now, instead of making a modest gain, they have exceptionally high losses. Their occupancy rates have plummeted. Their expenses and operating costs are through the roof. So again, when you look at this graph, you might say, well, you could attribute some of that, I guess, to the pandemic and what was happening, etc. Let's go to this next graph. So adjusted net cash flow for the Addison, for this building. And it shows it from 2015 to 2023. So it's increasing from 2015, 2016, 2017 look okay, 2018 looks okay. And then from 2019 to 2020, it drops from $362,000 to negative $683,000 in a single year from 2019 to 2020. And then it just continues to, then it's $980,000 in the hole, 2022, $1.8 million in the hole, 2023, $2.7 million in the hole. And they juxtapose that to what was happening from a housing policy perspective and law in the city of Seattle. And again, they do this in great detail. So they talk about in 2018, the Fair Chance Housing Ordinance, which prevented landlords from denying a prospective tenant residency based on their criminal record. Okay, so now we're starting to chip away at the ability of landlords to make sure that they have high-quality, trustworthy tenants. All right, 2019 roommate ordinance. It bestows the right to occupy a rented unit upon any roommate or immediate family member, prevents landlords from denying occupancy based on criminal history, prevents landlords from screening any family member, which is broadly defined. So again, you're chipping away at really the ability to run an organized, safe, functional, reliable building when it comes to the types of tenants who are there. All right, so 2020. Now, this is pre-pandemic. This is like right at the cusp of some whispers of the pandemic, overseas. Winter eviction ban. It forced landlords to allow tenants to occupy their property even if they stop paying rent entirely for 3 months or more. So then you've got all of that anti-landlord animus that has already been building up, right? And it's over time as you have turnover. Now you can't check for, now there's restrictions on criminal status. Now you've got this roommate policy where they could have people coming and going whenever they want, not really any sort of restrictions on it. So it's starting to chip away, especially these low-income housing providers. And then, of course, you've got the eviction moratorium, which initially might have made sense, but continued to go on way longer than it should have and never required proof that you had been financially impacted by the pandemic in any way whatsoever in order to use that as an excuse to avoid getting evicted, which never made sense to begin with. So then go to 2021, 180-day notice requirement in Seattle required landlords to provide tenants with 180 days of notice before imposing any rent increase. And then in 2021 as well, economic displacement relocation assistance. Landlords then had to pay all these costs associated for low-income tenants. If the landlord increased rent by a certain percentage and the tenant said, well, I have to move, then you have the landlords who had to bear the burden of the cost of helping that person move. So you have all these things stacking up, and you can show, like, this state, their profits and losses and the types of regulations that are being passed. And there's clearly a correlation that the pandemic alone cannot account for. For instance, the quality of the tenants that they're getting. They include in this lawsuit images of these units that they have that are just being destroyed. I mean, we've seen this, right? In the low-income housing units where they try to put homeless people in there without actually mandating, or people who are drug addicted, that they actually go to treatment, or that they, have obeying certain rules, and then you can't evict them because of all these policies. So they're in there just destroying these units, which obviously increases the costs for a building like the Addison when they don't really have a lot of revenue to work with. And at the same time, so it talks about the cumulative effects on this one building of all the policies that I just laid out. They say they can no longer screen or manage the tenants in a way that can maintain a safe and healthy environment. So you've got people in there who, are causing problems. And then what does it lead to? Well, the people who were in there, truly low income, not causing problems, just needing an affordable place to live, well, they don't want to live around dangerous people either. It says many of the Addison's tenants who have done nothing wrong have been forced to move to seek a safer home. There's proof of that. There's evidence of that. We've heard that in other low-income housing units as well. Occupancy rates and rent collections have plummeted. So again, they're already low income. They were doing just fine before all of this went into effect that made it very, very hard to evict someone. So these low-income people were paying their rent. But it's like, well, now, oh gosh, well, it makes it really hard to evict someone. You've got backlogs of like 2 years. You've got some guy in a beautiful $1 million home in Bellevue who can get away with it for 2 years and not get evicted and get a big fat check from the taxpayers to help cover his back rent. So why wouldn't these people? It says GRE cannot run the Addison at anything but a significant financial loss. Maintenance and security costs have increased. They're currently unable to pay their mortgage and they're in default. The property is not sellable at all, they say, due to the inability to generate positive net cash flow. Yeah, how are they going to sell it? Hey, anybody want to buy this building that's operating at a massive loss every single year? No. It says the collective impact of the city's ordinances amount to a physical taking. I also want to just throw, and I know this is really in the weeds, but I think this stuff is fascinating and it's undeniable, right? We're not talking, one of the things that's so interesting and I think will be so effective about this is we're talking about a low-income housing provider. We're not talking about some massive sky rise where rents are $4,000 in downtown Seattle and, oh, woe is us, we can't make a profit. No, this is a low-income housing provider operating on the margins as it is. And they are in great detail explaining how the policy and the impact. So on the rent collection, right? Which again, you cannot contribute this significant of a change to the pandemic. You just cannot do it. So it talks about, so first of all, 2015 to 2018, it has its expectation for net cash flow versus the reality. And actually, they were doing great. Their percentage difference between expectations versus reality for net cash flow was actually 90% higher. So their actual cash flow is 90% higher than even expectations 2015 to 2018. Now let's see 2019 to 2023, negative 367%. Their expectation of what the cash flow would be versus the reality. And then you see, this is a graph that shows the rent collection. So 2015, at this building, Addison, they had 90.6% rent collection. And why do you think that is in 2015? Well, it's because it's a low-income housing unit. So you have people who are there because they need a low-income, affordable place to live. So they're probably very grateful to have it, right? And there are laws in place that are going to tell them, hey, if you don't pay rent, you won't be able to keep it. And these things are hard to come by. So you had people who were very, very eager to obey the rules, right? Like, hey, I don't want to lose out on this opportunity. I need an affordable place to live. This is right in the heart of downtown Seattle. And there are rules and expectations of me. So I'm going to pay my rent. 90% payment of rent. What is it now? 44% payment of rent. 44%. No wonder they're operating at a loss. So to me, this is a fascinating case just in general, because this whole idea of regulation to the point where it amounts to an unlawful taking of private property by the government is just a fascinating conversation that I think could apply to many other things. I mean, look at some of these small businesses that have just been regulated out of existence. But then there's this question of, will this finally be the thing that wakes up progressives who have been pushing nonstop these rent control policies, landlord controls, etc. And now it's happening in Olympia in earnest, where they say, okay, we talk all the time about needing to help the poor and the low income and needing more affordable housing, needing more availability of housing. But now we have all these low income housing providers who are struggling to get by and who are in default, can't sell their properties, can't do anything. So the heartstrings aspect of it here, is this the thing that finally wakes up to progressives to say, you're not helping the people who you say you're setting out to help? Because the result will be they just close the building. And that's hundreds of units of affordable housing gone like that. So we do a segment on the show every week with Sean Flynn of the Rental Housing Association of Washington. And so I just figured we got to use that segment to ask him about this. And we'll get into it with him. He's not involved directly in the lawsuit, but knows an awful lot about it and has been advising this company and the Rental Housing Association of Washington on kind of where they go from here and helping them out with the legal ins and outs. So Sean Flynn of the RHA. Sean, welcome back to Undivided.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Yeah, so you guys aren't a party in this lawsuit, but this is longtime RHA member, right?
Yeah, that's right. We're here in supporting our member who's going through, who is the plaintiff in the lawsuit. Yes.
Yeah, this is, I would say, a pretty unusual lawsuit. I mean, the idea of like a taking of property essentially through regulation. So you're also an attorney. Explain the ins and outs of what their argument is here.
So effectively, they're not telling the city that it's unconstitutional to pass these ordinances. What they're saying is that, hey, you can pass these, but in passing them, you've effectuated a taking of my property through them. And so as such, you have to pay just compensation for that taking. Sometimes it's referred to as an inverse condemnation claim or a regulatory taking.
Do you see this often in the kind of law you practice?
Not often. Yeah, it's a pretty rare claim. What makes this claim interesting is it's not about a single event. It's about the combination of all of these ordinances that were passed between 2018 and 2022. Effectively, the lawsuit is saying that it's the combination of all of these lawsuits that had a compounding effect that effectuated the owner-operator not being able to function under the regulatory restrictions that they have to have. This building is a very specific type of development. It's called a LIHTC building. It's what it stands for, Low Income Housing Tax Credit. And so as such, it is required because of the funding mechanism to provide deeply subsidized rent. So the folks that live in this building are 60% of AMI. And this sort of regulation, the ordinances that passed between 18 and 2022 really hampered their ability to function in a way that could make the building viable.
What's interesting, you'd mentioned, it's a kind of rare kind of lawsuit, but as you said, we're talking about affordable housing. So I guess for that reason, sometimes the Seattle media tends to paint like anything a landlord does is like, landlord, big, evil, bad, but this is a low income housing provider. So for that reason, when they spell out how difficult it has been to be able to operate this building that's providing, what Democrats say we need more of, that has to be sort of this like conflict for how it's going to be covered in the media.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, first and foremost, I think anyone who provides housing, whether it be low income or market rate, is doing a societal good. People need places to live. That being said, LIHTC deals, the low income housing tax credit deals, we should be lining up one after another to get done in the state and in the city. They are a complex transaction, but when they work well, we're able to leverage out-of-state money and federal tax credits to build low-income housing and operate it in our state and community with very little, if any, state or local city support and from the taxpayer. The Addison, which is the GRE downtowner building, is not alone in this. This is an industry-wide issue, and it needs to get rectified.
So yeah, it's interesting because you have all these policies that I think are intended, if we like take it at face value, to help low income people or people who are struggling to afford rent, to be able to make sure that they have a place to live, that they can stay in there, reasonably. But at the same time, if those exact policies are going to shut down some of the low income buildings, it seems like that's a little contrary to the point.
Well, yeah, you want to build policies that allow folks to operate the buildings that house the people you were trying to help. Um, and these policies, one by one, ended up doing the opposite. They were designed to stabilize the tenancy and housing of our most vulnerable populations in the city, when in the end, they did the opposite. And I will say that, it wasn't this Seattle City Council that passed these, it was the earlier city councils. And folks like the Rental Housing Association and other organizations screamed from the rooftops to be aware and wary of unintended consequences, exactly like we've seen. So 6 years later, here we are, and all of the things that we warned them of have come to pass. And the people who are suffering the most were the folks these ordinances were designed to protect. And this is a tragedy. The fact that this lawsuit had to be filed is a tragedy unto itself.
Do you think it'll lead to more? I mean, like you said, this isn't the only building, the only company that's been dealing with this.
I don't know. I think that other folks are going to watch this lawsuit with a very, very close eye. And I think that if we don't have policy correction, of course, a course correction here in policies, then you could see a lot more either bankruptcies of low income and affordable housing going back to banks, or you can see more lawsuits. But one way or another, something has got to give here because the current situation is unsustainable.
Yeah, 100%. Something has to give. And I really think this could be the thing that helps, only because, again, how do you vilify it? And I saw the mainstream news is covering this, which is good. I'm curious. I've got to read a couple more of the articles to see if it's being spun in some way. But typically, they'll vilify the landlord side of things. But when you are a low-income housing provider and you're just telling them, here are the numbers, here's where we're at, how do you vilify that? I mean, I'm sure some of the Seattle media will find a way. But it's a very real situation that is only going to hurt the poor and low income who rely on these units. And if this continues to happen, there are going to be far fewer of those units. But just generally speaking, the idea that the city of Seattle is being called to the floor to account for what really looks like on paper a regulatory taking is fascinating. It's necessary. So we're going to be following this very closely. And also, as Sean Flynn said there, something has to change. We need to make sure for the November election, you need to tell your friends, there are some pivotal races. We cannot hand control over the Senate. It's already in the hands of Democrats, but there still was at least enough votes and common sense Democrats to stop a policy like rent control. Man, if there is a supermajority after the November election, we've already put out this whole list of races where you just got to vote for Republicans to block Democrats from a supermajority because that will give them rent control. And then in like the 45th legislative district on the House side, you got to vote for Larry Springer. He's a Democrat, but he's in a race against someone who explicitly supports rent control. So if you're in like Kirkland East, I think like Kirkland, Redmond, Duval, basically, and you got Larry Springer on your ballot as a Democrat and you're a Republican thinking, well, I'm not going to fill out my ballot in this race because I'm not voting for a D. Circle it in, buck up, Buttercup. You got to vote for the Democrat in that race because we cannot let his challenger through, because I think that will mean rent control, which we just cannot do. And I mentioned Sean Flynn. We do this weekly segment with the Rental Housing Association of Washington, and we started it. They wanted to be just a traditional advertiser, and we said, well, why don't you come on once a week and talk to us about housing issues, because we were covering this eviction nonsense and the backlog, and we want to keep attention on these issues heading into the legislative session when we know they're going to continue to push these policies. So, and protect yourself. If you're a small to mid-sized landlord, you've got to protect yourself and have someone in your corner. So become a member of RHA, rhawa.org, rhawa.org. Do that today. I mean, you saw that they're helping this particular building owner try to navigate this complex situation. So wild stuff.